That's super cool. So I'd be curious to then talk about like Ehrman and misquoting Jesus, because a lot of times like evangelicals are like, we're looking at this like, oh, we got to like take this book down. We got to show like why it's wrong or something like that. So how, like, in your opinion, like how do Christians strawman like Ehrman in this book? Like what don't they understand?
Yeah, good. So there are a number of passages in Misquoting Jesus, which sometimes they're rhetorical. I've interpreted Ehrman here as being rhetorical in some cases, and in the video series I back that up, my interpretation of that. That, for example, when he's asking a question, there are a number of ways we can interpret it. Is he making a radical claim about his own beliefs, or is he wanting the reader to simply ponder these questions? Right? Those are two different ways of interpreting how an author might use a question. And so sometimes I think these scholars have interpreted him to be holding to this radical view, when in fact we have evidence in many cases, both in writing and in public talks, that he does not hold to those views. So I think it's more appropriate to interpret those questions as rhetorical, that he wants the reader just to be thinking about these things. There are other cases where Ehrman will make, you can sense his enthusiasm. I'm happy to read a passage here, because this is one of the most famous passages that some Christian scholars have drawn from, and they don't give broader context. So we'll get into where they strawman him here. And so it's right in the introduction. So it's right away. He talks about his experience going through his academic work, and basically his experience in learning about textual criticism. He says, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or the copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later. In most instances, they are copies made many centuries later. And these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places. As we will see later in this book, these copies differ from one another in so many places, we don't even know how many differences there are. Right? So you get this grave sense like, oh my gosh, we're so far removed from the originals that we can't know what the originals actually said. That's to take Ehrman at that and draw that conclusion would be inaccurate. It would be a hasty conclusion that someone's coming to. In fact, in the very next paragraph, he qualifies that a lot of these errors are minuscule and are meaningless, no more than they can demonstrate that we can't spell accurately, and they couldn't either. And we've got spell check and we still misspell words, right? Or that there may have been slips of the pen, right? A lot of these errors that happen in the transmission process, these variants, these are 99% of the cases, right? But sadly, some apologists and scholars do not credit Ehrman with making these important nuances, even though he does. He does. Now, maybe he doesn't do it the way that apologists would want to have it done, but you need to give Ehrman credit where credit's due. And I think in some cases it's just so obvious. So one example of someone who strawmans, and it's the most egregious. In the series, I document a number of cases and persons that do this. The most egregious case is Timothy Paul Jones's work, Misquoting Truth, where he is explicit. He asserts explicitly that Ehrman does not nuance or talk about the importance of these differences. And that's explicit language. And that is, frankly, it's just false. It's wrong. And, we Christians should do better to communicate what our opponents hold. And so I really think that, this book, Misquoting Truth by Timothy Paul Jones, really needs revision and some sort of statement to come out saying that, he was not careful in reading Ehrman or whatever it was that led him to write what he wrote. So, yeah, there are other cases. I'm happy to go into those as well. And sometimes apologists are almost set up for it too, like with Peter Williams. And that happened in a Crossway interview where the interviewer just gave him a select quote from Ehrman. And, to Williams's credit, he, I think, tried the best he could, but still sort of attacked a straw man. I mean, plain and simple. It's not Ehrman's view. So yeah, it happens sadly, and we should just try our best to charitably understand people. I think that should be our first disposition. We want to have clear communication, and so we want to interpret with integrity.